Hey, this is Brandon with Team Evans RC bringing you another how-to video. Today I'll be showing you how to build your own home, fly a plane, and become a jack of all trades. No, I'm just kidding. Today you'll be learning how to solder with a few things, different connectors and wires so you could get the hang of it. But it definitely is a good start and a great skill to have, especially in this hobby. So a few things you will need. You're going to need a pair of scissors, pliers, and something to kind of scratch like a pick or any tool you don't mind kind of scratching up a bit. And of course you're going to need a solder gun and some solder. I'm just using the basic solder, no flux or anything in it, just a standard solder. So let's get you guys at a good angle. Let's get this all started for you. Also another helpful thing is what they call helpful hands. Basically a good clamp to kind of hold your product that you're working on, your wire, whether if it's the wire or the connector itself. Definitely useful so you're not trying to use your fourth hand to try to hold the whole thing. Alright, so the first thing we're going to start on is soldering the wire to a connector. A lot of people do have problems with this just because it is going to be a little difficult when it's on the car and whatnot. Now, a very important thing about soldering is on the entire wire, you want the entire thing coated all around it. So you start melting the solder to it. And some wire does take a while, so you just want to leave your solder gun right onto the tip of that wire just to get it hot, warm, and it absorbs the heat so that that solder will actually melt to it and go around the entire piece of wire. I like to apply just enough to where you basically see as all the copper wires become one solid wire piece. Now I will be showing you guys a couple different size wires today. I'll be showing you guys the standard 12 gauge, which is what you're looking at now. This right here will be 22 gauge wet noodle. They're all wet noodles. Basically that's just, they're flexible instead of hard and really hard to work with. And this will be 10 gauge wire, so a little bit thicker than what we're working with right now. So once you do get that set, careful, you are working with very hot stuff, so just be cautious. Take your time with it. This trade is very time consuming, but just have some patience with it and it'll work out for you. Now this connector is called a Dean's plug, used very commonly on any RC products, a lot of associated products. Just personal preference, there's a bunch of different ones, and I will be showing you a different plug just to clear up how to do it. So this one unfortunately was already soldered previously, so there is already solder on the tab here, as you could see. If there wasn't though, and the tab was just fresh, that's what this little pick thing is for, or whatever tool you have, just to kind of scrape it up there. And when you do scrape it up, it actually gouges into it, so when you put the solder on it, it grabs that tab just a little bit better, because all in all you are putting solder right onto a copper tab. So now with this one, we already heated this up, we put the solder onto it. The next thing you want to do is you make sure, of course, get this warm. And like I said, it does take a while sometimes. And when the solder is nice and shiny, that's how you know it is somewhat melted and ready to be soldered. So I like to do that first on the connector, make sure it's all ready to go. And then we can put the wire, put it on top, and just hold it there for a while. A lot of people put a lot of pressure onto it. You don't need a lot of pressure, just a good contact. Basically you're delivering power through it, but in this form would be heat. You just kind of want all the solder to melt. Now another hard part about this is a lot of people do leave it on there for a little bit too long, and this copper rod right here, this tab does melt in the plastic of the Dean's or whatever connector you are using. So you definitely want to avoid doing that by warming up the tab first and making sure that solder is shiny. See that there? And like I said, I'm not putting shrink tubing on this one specifically because I personally will not be using this one. But initially, like since it's open, you would put a shrink tubing over it, like a piece exactly like this, and use something hot like a lighter, torch, fireball, something, lava, to kind of shrink it down on it. As you can see there, that is a pretty solid connection. I always like to pull it, you know, kind of confirm that it's not going to go anywhere. As you can see, it's really solid onto there. Now the second thing that you'll be learning is how to splice. So, see, I already previously cut this for you guys. Say it broke off in your car, or you weren't really paying attention and your wire was wrapped around your tire, you gave it full throttle and your car shut off and you're wondering what the heck happened. And you see two wires split and they're the same color. Well, we'll say they're the same color. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to splice them together. Now this is how to splice. It's going to be the same process. You are going to want to cut it very slightly. Like I said, you're not too much. When you splice wires, I typically like to kind of, this is also called, you know, splicing, whatnot. I want to expose a little bit more of that wire. Kind of hard to see. Yeah, a little bit more of that wire because we're going to overlay them. I'll show you in just a second here. Bam. Just like that. Now that is going to be hard to do. It's going to take a couple tries, but like I said, just take your time with this and you'll be getting it pretty quickly. So our helping hands, always use one. I mean, there are helping hands with one side and the other side, and then some of them are like these ones right here, how I have the adjustable ones, and you could use a wire in this one and a wire in the other one and kind of move them together and kind of get it situated, but you will have a hard time on that sometimes because you'll move it and it'll be just off and whatnot. So what I usually suggest to you guys would be just kind of use one. You really only need one. Just hold that side pretty much, and then this one you could use with your hand. You know, you have a hand to use it for. Same thing on this situation. Let's see if it gets a good angle there. Coat the entire wire all the way around it with solder. Now typically if you do let the wire absorb the heat and then just put solder at the top, it will rotate itself to the bottom and cover the whole thing. But I always like to double check and then just add a bunch to it. You don't want to add too much where there's a big old glob. As you see, there's a little glob on top of here. You want to take that off, and like I said, always keep your solder gun clean. Clean it off with that little sponge soaked in water that you started off with. And here's that one. So that one's done, already coated with solder. This one here. Also, one more thing, while you splice these, when you cut these and expose the wire, if it's really long, this one's not too long, but if it is really long and the wire stays exposed, say double what this is, you do want to grab the wire and twist it so it intertwines on itself. So it's a lot easier, it kind of holds its own form, and it's just a lot easier to put solder in, solder to anything else. Alrighty. Like I said, one more time, same thing with this. Put solder all the way around it. And like I said, you don't need to put a ton of pressure, just pushing down on the whole thing. It really doesn't do anything for you. Just have the patience, put some solder on there, wait till it covers the whole thing, and clean your solder gun. Soldering iron, whichever one. Alright, now that we got solder on both of the ends, now you could put one end in. I'm putting the connector end just because it's just a little bit easier, a little bit heavier. I don't really want to uncomfortably hold that, and this side is just a little bit easier to hold. Now this one I will be putting a piece of shrink tubing because it is a splice. The splice is, you don't really want to see an exposed wire. They could touch each other somehow, some way, and it can and will happen. Guess there's a theorem or something like that. So the next thing, like I said, is going to be an overlay. Let's make sure you guys have a good angle here. Alright, so the overlaying is not right to the tip of each other. It's going to be more so on top or underneath. So, or I guess side, depends on whichever way you're looking at it. But just match them up to each other and take your time with it. Just let the solder gun touch both wires, have them melt to each other. Like I said, when it's shiny, that's how it's wet and melted. And then once it gets more cloudy and dull, the actual soldering itself, then that's when it's dry and, well, cooled down and more of a solid piece of solder. And then once again, you always want to kind of test it, tug on it, make sure that the connection is pretty solid there. And then throw your piece of shrink tubing over it. Let's see, my torch or lighter, whatever you call it, is probably in Mars right now. It's nowhere near us. This is a little old school trick. You could kind of use the heat from the solder gun to shrink down the shrink tubing. Like I said, this is a standard 12 gauge wire. So very basic. This is a battery lead. It's a female one. But like I said, very basic wire. So very common on RC products. So this is the most common one, pretty much. If I had a lighter, this would be much better. But pretty much once it's done, there you have it. Your little splice there, and it's on the connector. All right, now let's move over to the 22 gauge one, I believe. It's just about that small. This is the 22 gauge wire. It's kind of hard to see, but the copper in there, there's not really that much. There's maybe 3-4 strands of copper. So stripping it down, which is taking the tubing off of it, is going to be a little bit harder on these ones. On these, I would probably suggest using the wire strippers. It's just a little bit easier, but if you're comfortable with scissors, just cut it, but pinch it. You're basically just pinching it. You're pinching it, and you're not cutting it completely. You're basically just pinching it, and you'll feel it once it gets a little grainy. And when it is grainy, that's when you're kind of cutting the wire. So just kind of back off as soon as it does get grainy and pull it up. Kind of hard for you guys to see, but there you have it there. All exposed wire. So like I said, on these ones, you could kind of see how the entire wires on the inside of them looks like there's about quite a bit of them, 5 or 6 different strands of them. You are going to want to intertwine it on itself. So you grab it and just twist it whichever way, right, left, up, down. Just kidding, not up and down, just right or left, just to kind of intertwine it on itself. And then straight to the helping hands again. Thank you one more time for that, my unpaid associate. And once again, solder on the top, kind of let the wire absorb the heat. And the bottom, just to check, just to be double. Be double, huh? Be for sure that there is solder on there. Then I'll cut another piece for you. So the part we just put solder on, we'll put that in the helping hands. It is the shorter one. Whatever shorter part or the kind of uncomfortable, weird part of the wire that you might have, put that into the helping hands. Make that one do the harder work for you. Work harder, not smarter. Same thing on this one. Just spliced it, intertwine it so it's not hanging around everywhere and it's just one solid piece of wire. Let's put solder on this one really quickly. Once again, you do want that solder gun on full heat. On some certain wires, like little tiny ones that go in circuit boards, you do want to turn it down a little bit just so you don't burn the circuit board or the capacitor, whatever you are working on. But most wires just themselves, just turn it up all the way. Alrighty, got the solder onto that one. And like I said, you want this to hold the helping hands, you want to hold the smaller piece because you're going to hold it here, it's going to get hot and you're going to drop it and it's just going to be a pain for you. Once again, overlay it, have the solder gun clean, have the solder tip touch both wires at the same time so it melts the solder on both ends. Kind of go back and forth with it, hold it still for a second or two, let it dry or cool down, and there you have it, another solid connection. And that is 22 gauge wire. This is more so like receiver wire, capacitor wire. So you will come across these every once in a while in RCs. Last but not least, for surely not least, is going to be the 10 gauge. A little bit easier to work with. The bigger the wire is, the easier it is to work on. So here, I'll show you. Cutting it is going to be quite a bit easier because you can see when it's pinching it. You could feel it when you're cutting through the wire or when you're cutting through just the actual rubber casing part. And you could hear it as well. Alright, so here you are. Got quite a bit of wire there. Quite a bit to it, so I always like to intertwine the wire every time I do splice it just to be sure that I don't get any stragglers or hitchhikers on there. These ones do take a little bit more solder, so take your time with it. Put your solder gun on there. Just keep taking your time. Now you don't want to feed it extremely fast, like kind of jam this into there, because then you get bubbles and then it starts kind of flying everywhere, and then that's just a little bit messy. So just have a good pace, steady pace. Kind of go all the way around, go through the top. And like I said, you can just keep it on the top and the solder will make its way around and the heat will make its way around. I like to just kind of go top, bottom, side, anywhere that I'm not looking, pretty much, that I can't see. I want the entire wire covered with solder. Let's take a look at that. Bam. See, now the wire is pretty hot, so it's pretty hot right now. But as you can see, the entire exposed wire is covered in solder, so it's perfectly good for soldering now. Bam, that one there. Alright, so let's just grab the other side of this. This is one piece, so I'm going to splice the other end. Now, on bigger wires, which is technically smaller gauge number, but the bigger the wire, sometimes you don't necessarily need to overlap them. That's why I wanted to show you guys 10 gauge as well to give you a great example. On this one, I already intertwined it, have no stragglers. Put your solder on. And like I said, it will take time, so take your time with it. Just cover the wire with solder. The more solder you use, the better, but like I said again, if there is a big glob of solder on there, you do want to take that glob off. You just want a nice clean coat of solder all over the wire. Not a swimming pool worth. Just enough to melt around the entire casing of the water. Of that swimming pool. Alrighty. Let's use our pliers on these ones because they do get pretty warm. Now on this one, like I was saying, you don't necessarily need to overlap these. Depending on what occasion it is, you can, but to get a shrink tubing over this whole thing, you're going to have to use a bigger one. It just doesn't look as nice. I don't have a piece of shrink tubing handy right now, but what you'll do on bigger gauge wire, like a 10 gauge, you can put them face to face if you do have a great connection on there. So let's get that started. And these ones are a little bit tougher when you are doing it this way because you want to put the solder gun in the middle because you have to get both sides warm. I am using a smaller tip on this one because I was previously soldering smaller wires. But no matter what tip you are, you should be able to use on any occasion. Just like I said, have the patience for it and have both sides collecting that heat. And when that solder is shiny and glossy, you could play with it. You could mess it, kind of move it around and whatnot. Get both sides. And then once it cools, it somewhat gets a little foggy and dim. It's not as shiny anymore. And that's how you know it's cooled. Now sometimes when you are soldering bigger wires, say you're soldering 8 gauge wire or bigger wire, you do want to flip it around and check the other side because the other side might not have complete solder on it. You might have it still exposed and whatnot. Right here, not the greatest because you still do have some stragglers hanging there, but that's what shrink tubing's for. It kind of covers up the mess. But as you can see, it's a solid connection there. And I believe that's all the wires we had today for you. If you found this video useful or learned anything from it, go ahead and solder that like button and subscribe for more content.